I'm fairly sure my cat saved my life last night. Believe me, I feel ridiculous making that assertion. Cats aren't exactly known for their heroically defending their owners. But I will swear on anything you like. I now owe my continued existence to my 13-pound furry gremlin. I just have the one cat, Bugsy, a rage-fueled 4-year-old ginger tabby. Her average day consists of sleeping, biting my feet, and shitting in my bathroom sink. Not exactly the hero songs are made of, but I love her despite myself. After all, she is the only pet I have ever had, and I would slay legions for her. I go to bed around 11, and she generally runs up and down the hallway for about 30 minutes before coming and curling up next to me. Sometimes I swear she is trying to smother me by wallowing all over my face and sticking her whiskers up my nose. So I didn't find it remotely strange to feel 4 little paws hop onto my bed and walk across my chest. I could hear her purring, and she circled on top of me, eyes closed. I reached a hand out to pet her. My fingers were met with a disconcerting texture, akin to the rough side of a kitchen sponge. Pulling my hand away, I could feel the purring rattling through my bones. My eyes flew open. Even in the dark, I could tell it wasn't Bugsy on my chest. The rough fur that covered this animal was blacker than the darkness surrounding it. It stood on long, slender legs that supported a skin and bones body. Its head was teardrop shaped, with no visible nose and eyes that were much too big. Massive, reflective orange eyes met mine. The purr deepened, a thumping bass radiating through my body. I stared, transfixed, into those luminous eyes. It blinked slowly, languidly. I realized I wasn't breathing and drew in a long, shuddered breath. It smiled. Hundreds of tiny teeth glowed in the scant light as the creature smiled, opening its mouth much further than it should have been able to. Hot air smelling of tar and smoke forced its way down to my lungs. The purr changed, gradually becoming higher pitched until it sounded more like the whine of an airplane engine. I felt my eardrums pop agonizingly. I couldn't think, couldn't move. The all-consuming need was to keep staring deep into those eyes. Galaxies and nebulae spun behind those eyes. The inky depths of the oceans could be found in those eyes. Hot liquid was dripping out of my ears. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the eyes were gone. The weight was ripped from my chest, and the purring stopped abruptly as the animal flew, shrieking, against the wall. I saw a flash of orange as Bugsy tackled the thing. My hands flew up to cover my ears as the shrieking continued, joined by the hissing, spitting ferocity of Bugsy. Bugsy flew back with across the bed with a loud pop. Finally coming to my senses, I jumped out of bed and flicked the light switch. Bugsy paced back and forth, tail twitching, agitated. Panicky, my eyes darted all over the room. The thing was nowhere in sight. I dropped to the floor and looked under the bed. Nothing. Bugsy licked at a scratch on her shoulder. I cautiously crawled across the bed to the far corner where the thing had been last. The only sign I could find of a creature was a vicious green liquid on one of my pillows. Shaking, I pulled Bugsy to me, looking her over. Aside from a couple of scratches on her, she was fine. I hugged her tight as she glared at me. I haven't seen any indication of it coming back, but I can't bring myself to turn the light off or to let Bugsy leave my sight. I took her to the vet today to make sure that nothing more was wrong. I had to tell him that she had gotten into a fight with another cat, but I didn't have a good explanation when he pulled a straight black claw out of one of the cuts. The earth is alive. I saw it with my own eyes. I was working for an oil mining business, one of those contract labor jobs you take to get you through another month. It's not glamorous, but it's a paycheck. We were expanding and finding new sites to dig into and extract oil from. To start a new dig, Michael, the foreman on my project, would prime the spot by hammering a huge nail into the ground to open up a hole or a crack, and then we'd set up our boring machine to drill down into it. 3,000 feet later, voila, liquid gold. We were priming a spot in New Mexico, in the desert at least 75 miles out from the nearest suburb or town. It was just me and Michael there at the crack of dawn to get the process started. The rest of the team would be rolling in a few hours later with the drilling machine. The sun had just peeked over the flat horizon, and sharp rays of light cut through the gray sky as we began our work. Crouching, Michael set the nail's tip against the dry ground and brought the hammer down hard. But it didn't sink into the ground as we had expected. It only went in a little bit. Michael looked at me in confusion, and then with new resolve brought the hammer down harder than before. The ground cracked, but this time the crack grew wider than we had ever seen. It looked like a strange, demented smile. And then it grew of its own accord, quickly spreading out from the nail, getting longer, wider, and then deeper. "What the?" Michael breathed. The crack twisted and turned, and we could hear what sounded like rocks breaking as it carved trenches into the once solid earth and then veered towards us. The pivot seemed intentional, but it couldn't be. That's not how nature worked, and I knew it. The crack snaked its way toward Michael, opening like a mouth as it approached him, and as he took a step back, he stumbled and fell into the ground's growing, gaping wound. He yelled out in surprise while I stood there in shock and awe, still mentally slow from the morning, partially unconvinced that this wasn't a dream I had yet to wake from. Michael then screamed out in agony, effectively yanking me out of my stupor. I scrambled to do something. Anything. He reached out his hand and his fingers fastened like a vice grip around my arm. I tried to hoist him out, but he wouldn't budge, his screams filling my ears. I looked down and saw that his foot appeared stuck or crushed, and as I looked, I noticed that I could see less and less of his foot, as if he was sinking. Then I noticed that the long crack that started this was gone. Michael's foot seemed to be trapped in a hole created specifically for him. It was like a mouth clamped tightly around his leg, with no space around him. That's when I saw it. The rocky ground surrounding him was creeping inward like a circular conveyor belt with him in the center, as if the earth itself was turning inside out, determined to move him deeper into its belly. I was hit with the sudden realization that he was being eaten alive. But by what? Nothing made sense, but I was watching it happen. With Michael still screaming, I threw all of my weight into trying to pull him out, but there wasn't a chance. The ground had swallowed him up to his knees by now. The next moments went by quickly, but my mind played in slow motion as I watched his pelvis disappear next, and then watched him vomit blood as his lungs were crushed. And finally, as it consumed his head, I heard the haunting sound of his skull being crushed, and saw bloody chunks of brain squeeze out of any opening they could find. And then, the earth was whole again. The crack closed up and smoothed over, leaving nothing but blood-drenched dirt. Instinct kicked in as I subconsciously called 911 and babbled incoherent cries for help. I was mostly catatonic when the ambulance and my coworkers arrived. I'm told my eyes were unfocused and crazy with terror, and all I could say was that it took him over and over. Police put me under intense scrutiny and interrogation in the days after. Everyone thought I had done something to Michael, but they couldn't conceive of how I could have hidden the body so quickly in the middle of nowhere. When they took a shovel to the spot where it had happened, they found him, reduced to crushed bones and decomposing flesh. It was like he had been stretched out or put through a human-sized dough roller. His head was just beneath the surface, but his feet were 9 feet down. The authorities couldn't make any sense of it, but I could. I saw the way the earth turned inside out, flattening and dragging him in. No one asked me to explain anything, though. They just scratched their heads, baffled. And since there was no possible way I could have done that to him, the case on me was dropped and moved into the annals of unsolved mystery. I took a long leave of absence from work, and during that time I spent most of my time bumbling around at home and watching TV, and what I started seeing on the news struck me with fear and validation. Stories of people mysteriously disappearing started popping up here and there. Miners, demolitionists, deforesters, polluters, explosive fishermen. Any times witnesses appeared, they would sound like lunatics, raving about the earth swallowing the victims whole, or inexplicable ocean swells pulling them down and away into the depths, never to surface even as corpses. Not long after those stories began, they stopped. I had started keeping an archive of them like an obsessive maniac, reading and rereading as many of them as I could, finally feeling like maybe I wasn't crazy after all. Then, the links I had saved stopped working. One by one, the stories would get taken down, or the sites disabled. Rumor has it the government is trying to avoid mass panic by keeping it off the news. According to a few trustworthy sources I found, including some friends I made here who have experienced similar events, the freak occurrences aren't over. In fact, they're becoming more numerous. I heard about a power plant in China that was leveled overnight just 2 days ago with 62 people inside. They all went missing, the report said, before it was taken down like the others. They aren't missing, though. Once someone thinks to do a little digging, I know they'll find all 62 of those poor souls inexplicably embedded in the earth like Michael was, stretched like taffy. For now, I'm laying low. I think it knows about me, though. I can't even put my finger on what it I'm talking about. Sounds crazy, but if the Earth really is alive and taking its revenge on the people it considers enemies, I was there with Michael that day. It must have noticed me. When I look out the window, I swear the trees are leaning over ever so slightly in my direction, like they're watching me, waiting to pounce. And just a few minutes ago, I felt a rumble in the ground beneath my feet. And again, just now, a little stronger. Did you feel that? My name is Conrad King. I work with my father in research and development at a large tech company. Over the past year, he and I stumbled our way through a very fascinating engineering breakthrough. We discovered that by vibrating a rare metal at a very precise frequency, we were able to manipulate the elements down to the atomic level. We constructed a device that optimized this process to the point of seamless accessibility. This device gave the user godlike power, granting them the ability to form objects using the atoms in the vicinity. From the point of view of the user, it appeared to create matter from nothing. I nicknamed this tech Genesis. Needless to say, the potential applications for Genesis were endless. World hunger, dwindling natural resources, all of which could be alleviated with our tech. It was exciting times. I even suggested publishing our data for free. We were to be the harbingers of a new era. However, the powers that be were not as philanthropic. The board of directors, of which included my father, viewed Genesis as an unrefined and dangerous technology. They decided to instead create and sell a tempered version of the technology that would go on to become a VR gaming accessory. My father developed it himself. He called it the maze. The maze would be able to create soft, virtual realities that users could minimally interact with and explore. Its greatest selling point was that the user would not require VR gear. To the uninitiated, think Matrix Light or Ready Player One. I hated how our discovery had been watered down. Reducing such a groundbreaking discovery to a video game was a slap in the face to everything we stood for at our company. I decided something had to be done about that. "Aren't you supposed to be cutting the grass?" says my father. We're in the backyard of our vacation home, sitting at the concrete bench at a table, a chessboard engraved into its tabletop. This was a dream. More specifically, a memory. Looks like we were in the middle of a game. "I'll get to that," says a smaller version of me, eyes focused on the board. "But first, how do you keep beating me?" "Because you're reckless," he says with a smirk. "You play from here. You need to play from here." His hand moved from his chest to his temple. I frowned. This makes him laugh. "Strategy, son. Always be the smartest person in the room." Younger me's face contracts slightly. "How?" "Calmly assess the situation," he starts, his focus back to the board. "Detect the variables at play. When you have that data, form a plan." It was the vinegary smell of oak and rain that first penetrated the darkness, followed by sounds of thunder, my phone's vibrations, and the coarse voice of my father's personal assistant. "Rough night, Mr. King?" I blinked myself out of my drunken stupor, exiting my dream. I then glanced at Red through the glass window pane that separated the front and back seats. Head pounding, I answered his question with a nod. William Redford was a tall British fellow who's worked for my father in the company for many years. He can often be found carrying out some designated chore. Thus, I've dubbed him our company's task manager. Outside of his administrative responsibilities, he's also occasionally asked to manage less imperative tasks, such as chauffeuring the boss's hungover son to the maze's beta testing trials. Usually, the night before a beta test, the company would sponsor a party that served as both a staff celebration and a meet and greet for the participants. I recalled very little from the festivities, so it must have been a good time. From what I remember, 4 individuals were to participate in the maze's beta test today. I was included in that number. I would occasionally volunteer to test products, especially those that show promise. Unlike those other times, though, this time I volunteered for another reason. We soon came along a vast woodland path that was comprised of tall, densely packed trees. They were staggered together so tightly it was difficult to view between them. This path eventually opened up to a wooden warehouse planted in the very center of a massive clearing. Acres of grassland surrounded the warehouse as far as the eye could see. The immediate perimeter of the warehouse consisted of flat gravel ground that appeared to encircle the property in almost a perfect semicircle. The warehouse itself was a decent size and was old with noticeable wear and tear. Our company owned several warehouses for various reasons, but this particular one I wasn't familiar with. As we got closer, I noticed the other 3 participants had already arrived and were grouped near the entrance, congregating under a canopy to avoid the rain. Red pulled up to the group and parked the car. "Last chance to escape, Mr. King," he teased. Now, it may have been my post-inebriated state, but when he spoke those words, I would have sworn there was a moment of perfect quiet, rain and thunder calming for that one instant. "Not this time, Red," I said with a smile while exiting the vehicle. As soon as I make it under the canopy, a dark-skinned, muscular woman paced towards me with her hand extended. "Glad to see you didn't die from alcohol intoxication, CK." "Mac!" My hand extended to meet hers. It was a firmer handshake than I had anticipated. "I'm glad to see your liver is still intact as well." Mackenzie, aka Mac, is a UFC fighter turned YouTube gamer personality with roughly 2.4 million subscribers. Her niche is the fighter gaming genre, obviously. We've consulted Mac to beta test a number of projects for us in the past, so she's well known within our company. Despite her towering, intimidating appearance, Mac was nothing but smiles and corny jokes. If it weren't for her job history, you'd think she'd be incapable of hurting a fly. My eyes then met with those of our other 2 beta testers, Abigail and Adam, fraternal twin gamers. Those 2 were slim, blonde, and outside of Abby's long flowing hair, were essentially clones of each other. They hosted several gaming profiles across multiple social media platforms. In total, their subscriber count exceeded well over 10 million, with a daily viewership of greater than 750,000. Adam's niche is in the gaming community was horror/action adventure genre, while Abigail's niche was puzzles/problem solving. I walked over to the twosome. "Hey Abby, Adam, thanks for coming." Abby gave brief eye contact with a smile before looking back down at her phone. I shook Adam's hand. "Same here. I'm surprised your company even knew we existed, Mr. King," Adam responded, establishing himself as the spokesperson of the 2. "Of course. I'm excited to get to work with you guys today," I replied. "And please, Mr. King's my father. Call me Conrad." After the pleasantries, we all stepped through the doorway, entering the warehouse. Before we proceed, let me explain that I was not part of the design process the weeks leading up to today's beta testing. I was busy working on another project. The actual layout and machinations of the game were, and still are, largely unknown to me. I had no idea of what to expect upon entering this building. In retrospect, my lack of oversight certainly could have contributed to our current state of affairs. We then found ourselves within a rather large room. It was rectangular in shape and similar in design to that of a hallway. 120 to 125 feet by 30 to 40 feet would have been the dimensions by my estimate. The wall in front of us was lined with doors of different shapes and sizes. The wall space between those doors were painted dark crimson and housed dozens of knockoff famous paintings. These included the Mona Lisa, Last Supper, American Gothic, etc. The floor was made up of thick, brown acrylic carpeting, and the vaulted ceiling housed a golden chandelier that casted a faint yellow tint over the room. This functioned as the only source of lighting, actually. Notably, there were no windows in this room. Not too far from where we stood was a large circular table that contained a spread of food fit for a king. Everyone looked to me as if to ask permission to eat. I nodded. As we made our way to the buffet, my mind continued to explore the room. And that's when I noticed it. It was subtle, but the dimensions of the space gave it away. It was a little too wide, and vaulted ceilings were a smidgen too tall. What I noticed was that the room shouldn't be able to physically exist within this warehouse. Were we already inside the virtual space? Had the game been turned on without us knowing? My suspicions were confirmed once I made it to the buffet table. I picked up my plate and the meat slicer next to the roast beef, both of which had the designated company's logo, a half-eaten apple imprinted on them. Though I wasn't part of the design process, I was aware of what the emblem meant. Objects within the virtual space were marked with it to help prevent users from confusing the game with real life. A gesture I grew to appreciate. This game's VR capabilities were breathtaking. I stared at the sizzling meat in the pan being kept warm by a smoldering chafing dish. It made me think of Genesis. Creating food should be beyond the capabilities of the maze. It was theoretically possible for Genesis, however. We just hadn't had a chance to test it yet. I pictured the CHO combinations within this slice of roast beef. I checked the piece of meat for the company's logo, just in case. My undertaking was interrupted by Red's coarse voice. "Good morning, participants," said a hologram version of my father's personal assistant. He startled the group. His torso had suddenly appeared through the center of the table and hovered over the food. "And welcome." His legs appeared from beneath the table as he walked towards us. As some of you may have already realized, you are now within the virtual space. Everyone looked around, this time with critiquing eyes. All nodded in approval. Red continued. "We call this space the maze. I am William Redford, and I will be your guide. Here at the maze, you will be thrown into a series of escape rooms. Each escape room has an objective that will need to be completed. You progress in the game by completing these objectives." "So it's like the Bodeborg escape rooms in Boston?" asked Adam, hand half raised in the air. "Correct. And like there, each room will have its own distinct objectives. There will be laws, however, that will persist throughout all rooms for the duration of the game. These laws are simple, but make up the intricate framework of this virtual reality. Law number 1. There are only 2 types of rooms: resting and escape rooms. Resting rooms will be placed before each escape room. Use these rooms to eat, rest, etc. Once you are ready to progress, simply go through the next available doorway. Passing through a doorway will activate the next room. Law number 2. There is no leaving the maze." Red paused for a moment to allow the tension to build. He then continued with a smile. "Prematurely. This will diminish everyone's experience. Thus, it is not allowed. You can only exit the maze once you've lost or finished the game." And law number 3. The objective of each room will sometimes be laid out in plain sight for you. Other times, your objectives will be hidden. You must complete this objective if you want to survive the room. There was a subtle but noticeable shift in Red's tone at the word survive. Final advice. The truth you know as true is a lie. Acknowledge yourself or you will fail, and then reality will become your illusion. I scanned my cohort and saw that they were eating this up, figuratively and literally. Please leave your smartphones here. As Red spoke, a table manifested in front of him with the basket in its center. Everyone obeyed the hologram's instruction. I dropped my phone into the basket, but I noticed a missed text from my father. I tried to reach back into the basket, but both it and the table disappeared into the floor. Oh well, I thought to myself. If it was important, he would have called. Though it was weird, he rarely texted me. That is all. My hologram will remain here as a guide. Please do not hesitate to ask any questions about the room, stated Red, back to his baseline courteousness. And please, do enjoy your time here in the maze. Mac and the twins mumbled amongst themselves in excitement. While the group was eating, I walked up to Redford. It was time for me to initiate my plan. I retrieved the device from my pocket that I had been working on for the past few weeks. I developed it to help me hack into the maze's local settings. I pressed the button in front of Redford and, after a few seconds, a flat, translucent command prompt screen popped up and a keyboard manifested. I was in. Context. For months, I'd secretly tried to publish our Genesis data for free. Security at HQ has been tight, however, and would remain so until product launch. This made it impossible to carry out my plan on site. So I came up with an idea of publishing Genesis via the maze. I would be able to send the data to an FTP server via the maze's server since the two were connected. Most of our beta testing are monitored by skeleton crews, if that. I figured the best chance I had at accomplishing this goal would be while I was inside the game today. By the way, yes, I knew what my actions meant. I knew I was betraying not only the company, but also my father. I weighed the pros and cons of my decision and made peace with the potential repercussions. You have to understand, Genesis had the potential to change the world. It was worth the risk. "What you working on there, CK?" Mac asked while making her second trip to the buffet table. "Oh, you know," I started to reply as I turned back to minimize the screen. "Just some work stuff." "Getting the most out of your free time before we start, huh?" she said as she continued her trek towards the roast beef. "Good. We'll need you focused when we go through one of those doors." I nodded, but that made me think about Red's monologue earlier. I didn't remember him giving us any clear instructions on how to start the game. Thought that was weird, seeing how following the rules was heavily emphasized. You would think something like that wouldn't be left so open-ended. Figured I'd get Task Manager 2.0 to clarify. "Red, quick question. Do we go through one of these doorways to start the first resting room?" Then, thinking myself clever, I asked, "Or are we already inside the first resting room?" It would make sense. There was food and we were sort of resting. "I'm afraid the answers to both of your questions are no, Mr. King." That didn't make any sense, I thought. "Hey guys," I heard Max shout from the buffet table to the left of me. I asked a follow-up question. "Then, how do we start the first escape room?" Mac continued. "Do any of you know where the roast beef knife went?" "The escape room has already started, Mr. King." Suddenly, everything goes dark. At first, there was silence in the darkness. Then, a loud sound of something crashing into the buffet table was heard. This was followed by Max screaming in agonizing pain. She cried out for whatever was happening to stop. Then, as abruptly as it all started, she went quiet, returning us to silent darkness. "Mac!" I yelled as I ran blindly towards her in general direction. The chafing dish must have tipped over during the ruckus, as the buffet table and the carpet underneath it were now in flames. The light from the fire illuminated the area near Mac. As I approached her position, I saw Adam had also come to her side and had pulled her away from the growing flames. Mac's body lied prone with the meat slicer sticking out of her back. Blood was oozing from multiple stab wounds. "Conrad!" Mac yelled, rolling onto her side. "This fucking hurts. Why does this hurt? What was that?" I looked around the room for the attacker. Though it was dimly lit by all the flames, all I could see was Abby still standing where we left her, near her table and uneaten food, seemingly frozen in fear. "Mr. King!" This time, it was Adam that yelled it. "What do we do? Is this part of the game?" I didn't purposely ignore their questions. I just didn't have an answer for them. Something like this should not be part of the game. We should barely be able to touch objects made by the maze tech, much less be hurt by them. I took a deep breath. Calmly observe. Detect the variables. Mac was losing a lot of blood, and the flames were growing around us. We had to act fast, and treating Mac had to take priority. Form a plan. "Adam," I declared. "If I'm not mistaken, you have first aid training, yes? Would you be able to tend to Mac?" He thought for a moment and nodded his head. "I think we need to stabilize the knife and try to pack her other stab wounds to stop the bleeding." "Good. Do that," I stated, then turned to face his sister. "Abby, can you—" "The doors are gone," Abby uttered, voice trembling as she pointed around her. "And the paintings are laughing at us." Sure enough, as the flames continued to surround us, the added illumination revealed a continuous blank wall, absent of all doors. This included the door we used to enter the facility, and those stunning paintings from before had changed. They were now intently staring at Mac, Adam, and myself with one hand pointed at us. The creepiest part, and why Abby thought they were laughing, was that they were now all donning wide, toothy, malevolent grins that extended from ear to ear. "Call 911, Red," I demanded as I walked back towards the hologram. "And end the game right now. We need to get outside." Red's eyes, calm as ever, followed me as I paced in front of him. "I'm afraid I cannot do that, Mr. King." I stopped pacing, caught off guard by his response. "And why the hell not?" I asked. But I knew his answer before he even verbalized it. "Law number 2, Mr. King. There is no leaving the maze prematurely." "Let's just slide right past the part where I flipped the fuck out on the hologram." "I think I found something," yelled Adam, unfolding a small piece of paper. It was hidden underneath the handle of the knife. It looks like a poem? "What does it say?" asked Abby, finally moving for the first time, walking towards her brother. "First," I interjected, making my way back to Adam as well. "How is Mac?" "I think the bleeding stopped," he replied, looking back down at Mac. "But she passed out a couple seconds ago." Adam coughed while he spoke. Smoke was filling the room. We were running low on time. We needed to find a way out of that room, and fast. And as much as I hated to admit it, it appeared the only way of accomplishing that would be to play the game. I explained my reasoning to the twins, and they agreed. I motioned for Adam to read the paper, since I was sure the poem would turn out to be the objective for the room. I was correct. Your memories have been conned. Do not trust the bond. Find the insincere peer and get out of here. Adam looked back at us after he finished reading aloud. What followed was a moment of dreadful silence that seemed to last forever. Does that mean what I think it means? Asked Adam finally. I found myself shaking my head, not wanting to believe the thoughts that were bubbling inside my mind. This note seems to be suggesting that one of us may have did this to Mac, I declared. That one of us, I started to say, but then trailing off. Is a traitor? Finished Abby. But how? Why would one of us hurt Mac? Could there be a mistake with the clue? That's unlikely, I stated. Adam handed me the paper, and I read over the poem once more. I then noticed the back of the paper had one more line. It read, Hint. Real eyes realize real lies. This was followed by a half-eaten apple. If that's so, then one of us here is a danger to the others, Adam suggested, as he and his sister both looked at me with condemning eyes. I was smart enough to know where that was heading. I decided to create some space between us. I told the twins we needed some further clarification of the poem, and I headed back towards the hologram. I suggested we all spread out, but the twins opted to stay close to one another. I didn't argue with them. I was beginning to feel faint and unsteady by this point as I was coughing nearly non-stop. The flames were spreading quickly and the heat was becoming nearly unbearable. I looked over at the paintings, who were still smiling and pointing towards Mac and the twins. Maybe it was brainwashing, offered Adam, as I slowly navigated around the flames. Could the game do that, Mr. King? Technically, it was possible, but something like that would need time, and we had only just started the game a moment ago. Also, only Genesis, not the maze, tech would even have the faintest chance of accomplishing something like brainwashing. And Genesis would have to be turned on for that too. And that's when I had realized what I had potentially done. I hastened my pace back to the hologram. We need clarification of the poem, I began as I sat down in front of Red. I opened the digital screen back up and perused the current settings as I queried the hologram. Does this mean that the insincere peer is one of us here in the room? That one of us here attacked Mac? That is correct, Mr. King. The words were painful to hear. Then it was brainwashing? I added. Then I sat back in my chair, defeated. Within the settings, Genesis was noted to be inactive. If Genesis, our most powerful tech, isn't causing this, then what is? What the fuck is going on? I'm afraid not, Mr. King, replied Red to my brainwashing comment. Wait, what? I said, confused. Then how? Why would one of us do this to... One of you do not exist, Mr. King, he continued, cutting me off mid-sentence. One of you is a fixture of the game, created solely for this room. It felt like a rock formed in my stomach, and I became lightheaded. How is that possible? I looked back at the twins, and their faces reflected the same terror and confusion I was feeling. Memories of this individual have been implanted in everyone's brain, Red started. Electrical signals in the brain are nothing more than a series of molecular compounds attaching themselves to brain receptors, after all. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The maze is able to create a person from nothing and implant memories? Also, we all met each other outside the warehouse, before we even started the game. I distinctly remember seeing everyone while driving up. And then, an uncomfortable thought hit me. Maybe it wasn't one of them that didn't exist. Could I be? My thoughts were interrupted by Abby's piercing screams. I stumbled to my feet and looked to where she and Adam had been standing. What I saw next, I will never forget. Abby was engulfed in flames. She was kneeling over as if she had been pushed. "Oh my God!" she cried repeatedly, each syllable sounding excruciatingly more painful than the last. Her hair had fried like it had been stuck inside of a light socket. Her face turned black, and the rest of her skin melted away. She was attempting to stand until she suddenly collapsed over. The screaming stopped, and the silence that followed became louder than the chaos before it. My legs buckled. I fell back into my chair and then vomited on the floor. Watching her burn to death had paralyzed me completely. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. But through my mental breakdown, one other thought popped into my head. Where was Adam? I looked around the room that had begun to get more opaque from the smoke. That's when I noticed that the paintings directly ahead of me had changed again. The creepy smile was still there, but this time, instead of pointing towards where Mac and the twins had been earlier, they were now pointing directly at me. Or rather, directly behind me. I suddenly heard a noise coming from my flank. I turned around to find Adam running full speed towards me, meat slicer in hand and toothy, malevolent, impossibly huge grin on his face. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, Mac comes running and tackles Adam right before he reaches me. They both land onto the now inflamed buffet table off to the side, both being sentenced to the same fiery death Abby suffered just moments before. What the hell? I repeated this phrase over and over while rocking in my chair. Adam was the insincere peer? But he was a twin. How could that be possible? But then Mac and Abby? Just as my brain was beginning to process it all, Red's voice interrupted the silence once again. Congratulations. You have survived the first escape room. Please proceed through the designated doorway to enter your resting room. Of course, the door manifested on the opposite side of the room. I and it separated by the roaring flames. But it didn't matter. I had already become too weak to move. I knew then that it wouldn't be the fire that would take me, but the smoke. I was trapped, condemned to die in this room with my cohort. I fell to my knees and screamed my discontent at Red's hologram. Surprisingly, it wasn't my impending death that caused me the most grief. It was that I was going to die with so many unanswered questions that bothered me the most. Specifically about this damned game. Despite my screaming, I had accepted my fate. At the time, I believed that I, or the company, was somehow responsible for all this. Thus, a part of me felt that my death here was justified. I sank to the floor and lied on my side, while the flames continued to close in around me. My vision had grown increasingly blurred, but while I stared into the coated black screen, I noticed something pop up on the monitor. Upload complete. End. Are you sure you want to send data? Type yes or no. Maybe I could do one thing right before I go, I thought. I reached for the keyboard, but then found myself barely able to lift my arm. Dizziness overtook me. I finally collapsed, all before I was able to click yes. Useless. Then darkness overcame me, and after the transient discomfort of gasping for air subsided, I surrendered myself to a calmness I had never felt before. I had found peace there in the darkness, and I was content. But it was the vinegary smell of oak and rain that first penetrated the darkness, followed by sounds of thunder, my phone's vibrations, and the guttural voice of my father's personal assistant. "Rough night, Mr. King?" asked Redford. "What the?" was my first thought upon awakening. I snapped myself upright and noticed I was able to breathe with ease again. I looked around. I was back in my father's town car, being once again chauffeured to the beta testing site. Was that all a dream? My dream notion was quickly disproved as we came upon a woodland path. A woodland path that I knew would soon open up to a very familiar yet unfamiliar wooden warehouse surrounded by acres of grassland and a thin patch of gravel ground that would enclose the property in a perfect semicircle. What came next was a sequence of futile acts. I asked Red about the game. I ordered him to stop the car. Despite banging on the glass, I was repeatedly ignored. I tried to open the door, but to no avail. I then attempted to call 911. And that's when I noticed my father's text. That same text from seconds earlier and from before I died. I opened it. "Don't bother calling 911, Conrad. As you may now have begun to realize, you are already in the maze." I paused for a second and looked around me. The rain, the car, even Redford. I then searched my surroundings and I nearly dropped my phone when I found it. But sure enough, there it was. On the back of Red's headrest was a half-eaten apple. I returned to my father's text. "Now, by the time you've read this, you should remember having died and then subsequently reset. Going forward, you need to know that that isn't happening again. Each time one of you dies from now on, it will be permanent. Resetting will no longer be an option. The company also knows about your plan to publish Genesis, Conrad." My heart leapt to my throat at this statement. I continued reading. "Redford was inserted into the game to offer you a way out. Abandon this fool's errand of yours and exit the game. Please. Mackenzie will die. Abigail will die. Zero chance of survival here, son. End the game now. I convinced the board to give you another chance, so show them you're a team player and move past this. Let this plan of yours go, I beg of you. Value life over scientific advancement. Each of these participants' freedom depends on your decision." And that's where the text ended, leaving off on what was a poorly veiled threat. My father is not only aware of what's going on, but it sounds like he's willing to hold these poor souls hostage and even let me die if it meant preserving his bottom line. Did he set all of this up? Did he sabotage the beta trials just so I wouldn't upload Genesis? I knew my father and I had our disagreements, but this was on another level. We began pulling up to the clearing with the warehouse in sight. In the distance, I could see the group under the canopy. I saw Mac waving and Abby's hair flying wildly in the wind. A wave of relief washed over me at the sight of those two. But then, to the side of Abby, I saw Adam. And that relief was replaced with both dread and rage. My eyes began to swell with tears as I stared back down at my phone. I wished things had been different. Wished I wasn't this powerless. So I took a deep breath. Calmly observe. The car pulled to a stop. Detect the variables. Last chance to escape, Mr. King. Just as I was about to cave into my father's demands, I noticed 3 bars in the top right corner of my phone's screen and form a plan. My phone had service, internet access, and that gave me hope. The internet access could have been fabricated like everything else in this reality, or something missed by the design team. If it was the latter, then we now had a tool we didn't have before. Not only would we have Google at our disposal, but we could also elicit outside help. If so, I know we'd be in a better position to circumvent future obstacles like Adam. We just needed to survive long enough to finish the Genesis upload. That had to be our priority. Though I didn't want to die or for the others to die, Genesis had the potential to change the world. It was worth the risk. So, to everyone reading this, please help us navigate the maze. The villains here, the designers, the board, and my father are human, and humans make mistakes. Our best shot of making it out here will be to exploit one of those mistakes. Last chance to escape, Mr. King, Red repeated. An urge to curse this faux Redford arose, but I resisted the temptation. Not this time, I finally replied. And with all the courage I could muster in that back seat, I opened the door and stepped out into the rain.